want to talk about the implications of the term liberal Zionism, both for people's possibly professional, I don't know how many of you are in the business, credentials and identities, as well as communal identities, as well as affective and emotional identities. And I think that's really key here to the debate. So first of all, liberal Zionism is, and I think Tony mentioned this, it's really a North American term. Israelis don't use it, and they use the term leftists, usually often more and more disparagingly as a self-identifier nowadays. But and so Tony, when you said that you didn't consider yourself a liberal Zionist in the old days, but rather a socialist Zionist, for me, and forgive me because there are philosophers in the room, and so this won't sound good, but I kind of lump them together. The reason being is that for me, liberal Zionism came as an offshoot of the kind of Zionism I was raised with, which was also the socialist variety, and I guess in North America we call it labor Zionism, obviously the Labor Party in Israel, there's youth movements, Habonim, Dror, these kinds of things. So socialism was perhaps the economic flavor of choice. Liberalism, I'm taking to mean now generally a humanistic approach to the sanctity of life and to the respect and dignity one must give to one another, whether qua individual or maybe even within the group in a more collectivist sense. But there's this sense of really human dignity and mutual respect. And so I know it's a very sloppy definition from a strictly philosophical perspective, but I think they're of a piece. And I think that's really what we're talking about when liberal Zionists are troubled by the occupation. And when liberal Zionists say that something is not quite right with Israel's Palestinian citizen minority and things have to be rectified, yet not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think that's really what Peter was getting at. Now, we can just briefly, and really Peter said a lot of this, if we're talking about prescriptions, if we're talking about policies, if liberal Zionism prefers a two-state solution and non-Zionism, anti-Zionism prefers a one-state solution. Really, the polling shows that, as Peter said, a majority on each side favors a two-state solution. The recent polls I've seen have only 10% of Palestinian support for a one-state solution. So this one-state solution business we're hearing, meaning a one-state democratic state, not a Bennett apartheid-esque one state. We're talking about more of a liberal secular or secular binational one state where everyone would have a right of return, land claims, flooding, whatever we want to call it. That is very limited support among Palestinians themselves. I think 11% in the West Bank, 8% in Gaza. Very limited support. Now, a little bit on liberal Zionism as a label. So let's say I was to buy into Tony's very persuasive short essay, both in what he's written and what he said today, particularly towards the end, where I started to feel a little bit, my cheeks reddened a little bit in shame, but in a sense of tension. I can't remember the exact words, but then Peter picked up on this about the tensions, value tensions, and what would the cost be to me? And I'll speak personally, and maybe it resonates with some of you. First of all, I probably wouldn't be invited onto this panel, okay? Because there'd already be one of each, right? So what would I be? Or actually I shouldn't say that. I wouldn't be invited onto this panel because I wouldn't have a category to represent. I guess I could join Tony but I wouldn't have a category to represent, so I wouldn't be on maybe not this panel, but other panels where there's only polls of two. I wouldn't be able to serve on board in my Jewish community. Okay, we're all too busy, we don't need another board, who cares, it's just power grabbing, Jewish communal politics suck anyway, we all know that. But what does it mean to be excluded from the communal conversation? It means you no longer have a voice within your community. And that gets to a major point that's really been bugging me lately, and I really do want to know all your thoughts, both of my colleagues and of you here. What are we doing this for? I'm a political scientist, so one could say that I have some policy expertise, perhaps due to my trade. I write in one of Israel's national dailies regularly, but it's in the English daily. It's the .com of Haaretz. Israelis tend to not read that. The Anglo-Saxon, the English speakers probably read the .com, but most Israelis are not reading that. I'm well aware that I'm writing for a diaspora audience, both Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, Jews, and everyone else. what do I really hope to achieve with all my punditry and all my writing and all my analysis and all my teaching? I also teach undergraduate students. What do I hope to achieve? I really have little illusions that I'm going to affect Israeli or Palestinian foreign policy. Okay, that's really honestly how I feel today and most days. So I think what I'm really trying to do is to save Jewish souls and anyone else who wants to come along for the ride. Meaning that I'm trying to instill a more humane way of thinking about world politics among my own community and not only Jews, other Canadians, whoever wants to read me online, any English speakers really in the world who want to read me. And so really it's quite far divorced from the actual policy machinations on the ground. And I really wonder what you guys think you're up to, and whatever anyone else who's in this field at any arm's length, what we think our goals are. So I would give up my voice within the communal conversation, which is really giving up the most important weapon, excuse the negative terminology, it's just the metaphor in my head right now that I have in my arsenal. It would also be a great identity cost, because I'm one of those atheist Jews that Sam mentioned, who goes to synagogue and even leads services. Don't tell anyone, you're not supposed to. The conservative movement lead the service if you're atheist, but okay. I'm busy anyway, I need to give up some of my jobs. And so what really animates my Jewish identity? It's not a belief in God. It is Jewish nationalism, mainly through power. Just kidding. That's the negative underside, right? That's the dangerous side of it that maybe does animate me, but I wouldn't want to admit that consciously, but we can certainly explore that. But really, what animates me is Jewish nationalism through culture, and mainly through Hebrew. I speak only Hebrew to my kids. I read as much Hebrew as I can, though I'm very lazy, so I try to subscribe a lot to Hebrew things on Facebook. To me, Hebrew and the revival of modern Hebrew through the state of Israel, including Hebrew literature, Hebrew poetry, Hebrew folk songs, and Hebrew pop music, is the way that I feel that I'm expressing my identity on the world stage. So if Tony wants me to give up my Zionism, and I get personally just to make it metaphorically here, I don't think I can, because my identity will be atrophied, and that speaks to our affective attachments. And I really want to get to this point about nostalgia. Tony, you mentioned that what's left after all the bad stuff is stripped away is perhaps simply a nostalgic kernel. I think nostalgia gets a bad rap. And I think nostalgia can have a very important function in politics. I've written about this actually in the Canadian context. And that is that we groups may need to cling to what seems like a more homogeneous or simpler path in order to more effectively recognize the other and recognize the other's claims and allow the other to perhaps take some of what was the collective self, what belonged to the collective self. Finally, if I were to say what I think the diaspora can do, because I don't think we can very effectively influence policy. However, there's this group called J Street here. They won't bring themselves to Canada, so I'm at arm's length. But I think they try to lobby your elected officials, who in turn can have some influence. And so there can be sort of a two-step direct way of influencing stuff over there. The Canadian context, the lobbying system, because of our parliamentary system is much less porous. We don't have the same kinds of ways of engines of influencing our policy the way you do, not to mention limits on campaign finance. Finally, I think that we could help promote a healthier diaspora Israel engagement, or a more robust one, as well as softening some of the sharper edges of Zionism if we promoted and adopted a more radical multicultural experiment in Israel. So that would mean not only bolstering modern Hebrew and Hebrew culture and Israeli culture and everything that goes along with that, using culture very broadly, whether it's political culture, more formal artistic culture, as well as encouraging Palestinian citizens of Israel to do what they most want to do. When I read just a piece just today on one of the blogs written by one of the Balad party candidates, and he said what they most want to do is have the Arabs, the Palestinian citizens of Israel have cultural autonomy, meaning more control over their culture. Now, I thought there were multiple school systems in Israel. There is a school system run in Arabic, there is a school system, then there's about 3 or 4 for Jewish kids. They already have their, I mean, the infrastructure for a robust multiculturalism is there. Seems like it won't take much more to ensure that Palestinian citizens of Israel have the proper positions in the Ministry of Education and all the way on down. Finally, in order for a more robust and healthy dialogue between Israelis and diaspora Jews, we need to speak Hebrew. We need to take that more seriously. And I know, Peter, you had an interesting, provocative chapter. It's provocative for the American audience, not for the Canadian audience, about investing more in Jewish day schools. I don't send my kids to Jewish day schools, so I can't get hypocritical here. But thinking about ways of bolstering really in-depth knowledge of Israel, and that it isn't, we're not simply, our kids are not simply here to be diplomats or Hasbara agents, but they're here to really engage with their imagined homeland in a deep and authentic way.